Hey everyone, welcome to session 313 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Dr. Cody Morris from Salve Regina University and the newly relaunched All Things Behavior podcast joins me to dive into a topic that has merited quite a bit of discussion in applied behavior analysis. These days, you pretty much have to be living under a rock in ABA circles to not have noticed the increased focus on assent practices in treatment programming. Cody is one of the preeminent authorities on this topic, and in this episode, we talk about the definitions of assent, how assent has been conceptualized in other fields, and how it applies to the work we do as behavior analysts. In doing so, we review Cody's article, Toward a Further Understanding of Assent, which was published in the winter 2024 issue of JABA. I'm going to try to keep these introductory remarks short because we have a lot to get into. So, long story short, if you're looking for a nuanced discussion on this topic that avoids the kind of binary black and white conceptualizations that sometimes you see, you've really come to the right place. Before we get to the episode itself, I do want to give some sponsor shout-outs. We're brought to you by Frontera. Consider taking a demo of Frontera's assessment builder and see how the ethical application of AI technologies can help you serve clients and save time. Head to fronterahealth.com to check it out. We're also brought to you by Mind Body Behavior's Certified Health Coach Program. If you're a BCBA looking to use your ABA skills to help people live healthier lifestyles, learn how to do it the right way with expert instruction, mentoring, and guidance from Sarah Burby. Better still, podcast listeners can save money by using the code BOP10 at checkout, so check the show notes for the link to learn more. We're also brought to you by HRIC Recruiting. Cut out the middleman and speak directly to Barbara Voss, who's been placing BCBAs in great jobs all across the United States for 15 years. We're brought to you by Behavior University, and their mission is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn about their CEU offerings, including their 8-hour supervision course and their RBT course, which has been recently revised and it's getting rave reviews. To save over at Behavior University, go to behavioruniversity.com/observations. There's a discount there waiting for podcast listeners. All right, last but not least, I am so psyched for this. The 2026 Verbal Behavior Conference. It's taking place March 26th and 27th in 2026 in Austin, Texas, or you can live stream it on Behavior Live. Presenters will include Drs. Mark Sundberg, Patrick McGreevy, Kyle Miguel, Alice Schillingberg, Sarah Frampton, Andresa D'Souza, and Danielle France. And they'll share how Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior can guide the assessment and treatment of generative learning challenges in children with autism and other developmental disabilities. And don't miss the pre-conference workshop on Wednesday, March 25th, led by Dr. Emily Kerwin and Gina Zacchentieri from All Points Behavior, which is formerly the Carbone Clinic. The discounted early bird registration price is only available for a limited time, so get your tickets right away. You can find a link to the show notes, or you can search VBC over at behaviorlive.com. All right, that's it for opening remarks. So let's get into this really fun conversation about assent and behavior analytic programming with Dr. Cody Morris.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sicoria.
Dr. Cody Morris, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How you doing?
I'm good, Matt. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here.
Same here. I wanted to have you on as soon as this article that we're going to get into came out, and we've had some email correspondence around the time of the publication, and one reason or another, the passage of time occurred, but here we are a few months later, and I'm glad we're set aside the time to do this. I'm grateful that you set aside time in your afternoon to have this discussion. And the paper in question here is Toward a Further Understanding of Assent, and that was, I believe, in the summer issue of JABA most recently. And I'll put a link to that article in the show notes so the readers can go check it out themselves, which I highly recommend they do. But I'd be remiss if I didn't start this conversation by embarrassing you a little bit, Cody, because one of the reasons I've come to learn about you is through your excellent podcast. And it's the Behavior Analysis and Practice Podcast, or the BAPcast, but now it's been rebranded, and I'll let you talk about that momentarily here after I finish saying nice things about you. But one of the there's a lot of ABA podcasts out there, and I think the work that you and your colleagues have done, and of course with all the help from the amazing guests that you've had, is really elevate the discussion of these important issues in our field. And that's hard to do. One of the things I think that you do a particularly good job with is that you don't just ask rote questions and receive answers. You participate in discussion. And one of my favorite things about the show is the elaborations that you add to the conversation using your own experiences. And you do so in such a way that up until a point of not becoming, you're not editorializing or anything like that, and that's a very, as an interviewer, I can attest that that's a very difficult needle to thread. So I just want to pay you some compliments there, knowing that that's not an easy thing to do. And if folks aren't familiar with the show, they should go check it out. And now I'll give you an opportunity to tell people what the new title is and where they can find it and things like that.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. Your podcast is the first behavior analysis podcast I ever listened to a long time ago. I've really looked up to you in this show with what you've been able to do to disseminate our science and information about our practice. So to get such a compliment from you means a lot, because I think, like you, I try to study like interviewing to a certain extent, right? To be able to have these conversations. And frankly, I think of you as kind of like a master in that domain. So to hear the compliment means a lot. So thank you.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say.
In terms of the new show, so the podcast is called All Things Behavior. It's available on all the major podcast platforms, so you can just search for that. Again, All Things Behavior. And that podcast was sort of a development from the Behavior Analysis and Practice podcast, grew out of that. And the sort of difference, or the reason that you're seeing some of the rebranding or the development, is that Behavior Analysis and Practice, the podcast, was created as a companion to the journal Behavior Analysis and Practice. And so as we ran that show for about 5 years, every single episode was focused on an article published in Behavior Analysis and Practice, the journal, which I enjoyed doing. Behavior Analysis and Practice, the journal, is one of my favorite journals. So I really enjoyed covering the journal for that period of time. However, after about 5 years of doing that, I started sort of wanting to be able to open up my scope and the things that I get to talk about on a podcast to topics a little bit more broad than just that published in Behavior Analysis and Practice, the journal. For example, I'm really interested in different methodology components to our field that doesn't come up a lot in the journal. So I was beginning to become interested in other topics, other areas. And around that same time, ABAI, who ultimately sponsors or sponsored BAPcast, was saying, hey, all of our other journals, because ABAI ultimately publishes 6 journals, are interested in something similar to BAPcast because we're seeing the positive impact that BAPcast is having on the journal, and are wondering if you can help us, brainstorm, how we can sort of spread the love there, if you will. And I said, hey, well, that comes up at a good time because I'm really wanting to open up the work that I'm doing personally to cover more topics. And so through conversations, it was decided that it would be of interest to everyone involved if we pivoted our efforts to a broader scope podcast, one that covers all of ABAI journals and more. And in that shift, it made sense to move away from title that was directly connected to a specific journal to a broader title being All Things Behavior. And here we are.
Great. And so I might have missed this in the transition, but is that the same podcast feed? In other words, if someone subscribed to BAPcast, are they going to continue getting the podcast just titled differently, or is this a different podcast feed? How did that shake out?
It's a great question. I'm glad you asked. It is a new feed. So on our last episode of BAPcast that we sort of plugged the new show, encouraged people to search for All Things Behavior. and to subscribe, like it, or, find a way of following it.
Great. And again, I'll have links to the new feed in the show notes and also the archive of the BAPcast, because there's tons of great episodes. I was listening to the one this morning on the survey on teaching philosophy in accredited programs. So yeah, it's just a great show, and there's many others that I've enjoyed too. So it's well worth going back and checking out some of the old catalog, and I look forward to seeing what's new with the new rebrand. So congrats to all the work, both you and your colleagues who are putting this all together. Now it's a team effort. Are you at BCBA feeling overwhelmed by the time and energy it takes to complete intake assessments for kids with autism? You're not alone. When hours are spent on paperwork instead of providing care, it slows everything down for you and the families counting on you. That's why Frontera exists. Frontera is an AI-driven, HIPAA-compliant platform designed specifically for ABA professionals like you. Built by Amal Deshpande, a seasoned founder and father to a child with autism, Frontera brings together clinicians and engineers to streamline the most time-consuming parts of your job. So what does that actually look like? With Frontera's smart tools like the Assessment Builder and Diagnosis Builder, you can reduce your report writing workload from 8 to 10 hours to just 3 to 4. That's more time for therapy, faster access to services, and less burnout. Visit fronterahealth.com to see how it works. Use code BOP25 at checkout to get 15% off both of our report writing tools. Let Frontera help you work smarter so you can focus on what matters most. All right, so let's get to our kind of normal starter question after, having talked some podcast shop for a few minutes. But so for those who aren't familiar with you and your work, I'd like folks to get to know you a little bit better before we delve into the main topic of Assent. So if you can let us know, how you got into behavior analysis and, kind of bring us up to speed with what you're doing these days.
For sure. So I happened upon Western Michigan University when I was interested in going to school to study psychology. So I'd watched the movie Good Will Hunting growing up. Man, I imagine you've seen that movie. Hopefully many of the listeners have. I watched that movie. For those who haven't seen it, Robin Williams plays a therapist in that movie who ultimately helps Matt Damon's character, overcome some issues. And I was really taken with that. And I thought, that's cool. I want to do that, So I went to school to study psychology, grew up in Michigan. Western Michigan University is a great school. So I went down to Western Michigan. And upon arriving there, found out that Western Michigan is like hardcore behavior analysis, right? Even at the undergraduate psych level, they're all about behavior analysis, which embarrassingly now, I'll be honest, I was a little resistant to when I first got there. I had a hard time articulating my problem with it for a very long time. And then I saw a talk by Anthony DeFulio who talked about his initial experience with behavior analysis. And his description was he just wasn't taken with it because, he's hearing about reinforcement and is thinking, yeah, no duh. On account of living, I understand that good things are going to increase the things that are associated with them and whatnot. So I didn't understand the complexity because I think there's something deceptively simple about behavior analysis. And then there's all this complexity underlying it. So if you just hear about operant conditioning, it's like, okay, big deal. It's only until you start, looking in the weeds, you realize how complicated it is and how impactful it can be. And so I spent essentially most of my undergraduate training not being completely smitten with behavior analysis, being very interested in research, helping out on different research studies, mostly in the clinical psych program. So I was a research assistant like 7 studies as an undergraduate and never was completely interested in any of them. I liked research, didn't love some of the research that was being conducted, just wasn't for me. And then I took a class with Stephanie Peterson, who was the chair of the psych department at the time and behavior analyst. And in that class, she just really opened my eyes to the importance of essentially behavior analytic research methodology and the utility in it, and how by using that methodology, you can help improve so many socially significant issues out there. And so that sort of planted a seed I became very much focused on sort of the science side of things. Still wasn't wanting to do behavior analysis. Ended up enrolling in a counseling program when I finished my undergraduate degree. But in the summer between my undergraduate and starting the counseling program, I happened to run into Stephanie Peterson again. I was talking with her, and she was saying one of her doc students was starting some research over the summer. I asked if I'd be interested in helping out. I was still interested in research, so I agreed to do it. And it was my first time being around behavior analysis research, and that summer I just fell in love with behavior analysis, seeing it be applied. That study was focused on the timeliness of feedback, looking at direct instruction and how it impacted direct instruction. I just thought everything about it was amazing. And then I started my counseling program. Frankly, in syllabus week, I realized that was not the right program for me. So I emailed Stephanie Peterson, asked if I could meet with her. I went into her office and, a little tail tucked between my legs. And I said, Stephanie, I think I might have made a mistake. She might deny the exact language, but in my recollection, she responded with, yeah, no shit. You need to be a behavior analyst, apply to my lab, and let's get started, which I did. And I worked with her for 6 or 7 years, and it was an amazing experience. Finished with my PhD in behavior analysis at Western Michigan. And that year when I was wrapping up, I was applying to jobs, found this school I'd never heard of called Salve Regina University, who wanted to hire a behavior analyst. Applied, ended up getting the job, and have been here ever since as the graduate program director. And so, work with master's students. We developed a PhD, so now I work with doc students here. And yeah, just love doing behavior analysis, get to explore a bunch of different areas through my students. So yeah, I'm really pleased with the way everything worked out.
So you went undergraduate through PhD in the same institution. That's kind of unusual, as at least in my hearing how these things typically go.
Yeah, I guess I got lucky. I happened into Western Michigan as an undergrad, ended up, getting to meet and ultimately work with Stephanie Peterson as an undergrad. And frankly, like Stephanie Peterson, it was just the perfect mentor for me. She has a very gentle way, and I can be a little prickly sometimes. And so we just worked really well together. And I thought, hey, why try something different? We're both getting a lot out of this. I'm learning so much. So I stayed working with her, and I certainly don't regret it. I think it was the perfect move for me. Certainly not the right move for everyone in terms of staying at the same institution the entire time, but it really worked out for me.
I see. And I can see a mansion in the background of through your window there, being, kind of born and almost nearly a lifelong resident of New England. I know that there's Salve Regina has a very unique campus if I recall correctly, some of the students can actually live in some of these gigantic mansions that are on the sea. Do I have that right?
Yeah, yep. So Salve is built in Gilded Age mansions ultimately along the coast. So, I mean, I'm literally, 300 yards from the ocean. If I lean back in my chair, I can see the ocean behind me. It's this big, beautiful mansion. So yeah, it's a really, really beautiful campus in Newport, Rhode Island.
All right, folks, you heard that here. If you are interested in getting some graduate instruction in behavior analysis and want to hang out in such a unique and just breathtakingly beautiful area, you can hit Cody up and check out the program there at Salve Regina.
Hi, everyone. Sarah here from Mind Body Behavior. Sorry to interrupt your podcast, but if you're a BCBA dealing with insurance headaches, canceled sessions, and constant authorization battles, I have something that could change everything. I know you've been told ABA can be applied anywhere, but no one's given you the actual roadmap until now. Mind Body Behavior is the first and only nationally board-approved health coaching program designed specifically for BCBAs and RBTs. We cover weight management, chronic disease, mental health, all from a behavior analytic perspective with deep integration of ACT and RFT. This 6-month program includes weekly live sessions plus on-demand content. You'll get 32 continuing education units, including ethics and supervision, and it follows the BCBA content outline. We've already had over 90 BCBAs graduate and successfully start their career shifts. Registration for the spring cohort is now open, and Behavior Observations listeners get 15% off tuition. Stop dreaming about applying the science you love in new ways and start doing it so you can fall in love with your career again. Go to mindbodybehavior.co/board health coach for more information and to save your spot, or check out the link in the show notes.
Let's get into Assent. I always love to ask people this question. We'll get into what Assent is and all the nuances, because there are nuances aplenty, of course. But what motivated you to write this paper in the first place? When I always whenever a paper starts off with towards I was like, okay, they're trying to say something really important here. It's like this big, bright stimulus that's like, well, someone's really trying to, get a point across here, right? So anytime, so I'm always interested in why people do, the motivation behind undertaking whatever project they're working on, or paper or study, what have you. But, especially so when a paper starts out with towards. So all joking aside, why'd you feel this paper was necessary to put into the literature?
Yeah, so I had been interested in the idea of assent and consent since I was a graduate student. And my first year post my PhD, I was still working a lot with Stephanie Peterson, and we ultimately got interested in kind of further unpacking and exploring the idea of assent. And so we did a literature review to see what other behavior analysts had done related to assent. How are they describing it in their papers, things like that. And so we wrote a paper, published it in JAVA in 2021 that was on the topic of assent, which I think just kind of when it came out and other variables became quite popular paper, which maybe sounds super arrogant to say, but it in terms of my own personal experience with publishing research, it was the paper that drew the most interest.
I'm sorry, I'm not an academic, but isn't the proper term well received?
Well received.
It was well received.
It was well received. Yeah. So it was well received. And I had opportunities to go around and talk with various groups about assent, both in conferences and consulting with organizations. And so sort of my initial interest and my own experiences with assent leading to that paper were really multiplied by all of the sort of feedback and experience I got to gain after publishing that paper. And that initial paper, if I were to summarize it, was basically like, hey, assent is important. There are different ways of facilitating assent arrangements if you're interested in doing that, even with people with communication challenges who are often excluded from those types of activities outside of behavior analysis. And that was sort of the gist of that paper. And then I think a lot of people took that very seriously and ran with it. But in the process of sort of advocating for assent and sort of pushing that assent can be embedded more often than you think, I saw what might be characterized as maybe some overgeneralization of assent, where the term was being applied to a lot of concepts or ideas or practices that didn't really characterize assent as I've come to understand it, and frankly, how a vast majority of the world seems to describe assent. And so the second paper was to help provide some clarity as to what assent really is and some of the nuance around ultimately arranging assent with clients of behavior analytic services.
So that paper, I've got it looking at the reference section of the 2025 paper, but the one you're referring to is Morris, Dietrich, and Peterson 2021, and that's in Java. I will also link that in the notes as well, so folks can go check that out. So I'm really intrigued by the overgeneralization of assent, and I think in our email correspondence, I kind of shared some of my questions about assent under, of course, I love the saying, under what conditions. I'm especially interested, with just about anything we talk about in behavior analysis, when someone asserts a claim of, X, Y, or Z is important, I'm like, okay, well, what are the boundary conditions when, so we're going to get to that momentarily here. But I think from a foundational perspective, it's probably a good time to just lay out some definitions so we all talking about the same thing. So given your scholarship and study and knowledge, deep knowledge in this area, what is your definition or the accepted definition? Maybe those are two different, I don't know if those are two different things. We get into that too. But what is assent in a nutshell?
Yeah. And I'll provide a little context, because your point about is my definition the accepted definition, or the definition I use the accepted definition. The context here is that the definition that I promote in the paper and that I'm going to promote now is a definition that is focusing on the critical features of assent that multiple disciplines, multiple professions, multiple groups that have been studying assent for a very long time are ultimately saying are the critical pieces. So, for example, I'm sure I'll reference this group a lot in this conversation, but the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, has been working on assent stuff since at least the 1990s, right? And so they've been working on like defining assent, how to facilitate better assent practices, stuff like that. There's for folks in America, there's the federal guidelines for research. How do they describe assent? So this definition is really representing those critical pieces. And to define assent, I think it's best to often start with a definition of consent, because most people listening to this podcast right now have experienced consent at some point in their lives, right? So the critical pieces of consent are seen as being someone with legal status, and that legal status is important. So meaning they're their own legal guardian. It gives permission for themselves or another individual. So a person can consent for another person if they're their legal guardian, after they've received adequate information about the procedure. So the adequate information piece is the informed consent. Oftentimes we describe consent as informed consent. It's a critical piece, with the expectation that the consent can be withdrawn at any time, right? There has to be the consent withdrawal piece within there. Again, that's what vast majority of the groups that do anything related to consent define consent as. The flip of that with assent is it's a person who doesn't have legal authorization to consent for themselves. So this is someone who is a child, so they're not their own guardian, or maybe they're in a conservatorship, so they're not their own guardian. Whatever reason they're not their own guardian, they don't have legal authorization to consent for themselves, but they're still providing permission for themselves to participate in a procedure after they've received adequate information. So that informed piece still holds true with assent. There's no point in getting permission from someone to participate in something if they don't know what they're agreeing to. Still with the expectation that assent could be withdrawn at any time, right? So the four critical pieces are the same. It's about their legal status, it's about giving permission, it's about adequate information, and it's about the ability to withdraw that permission.
Hey everyone, just another quick break here in the podcast. I want to tell you about Behavior University's webinars. Their webinars are free. That's right. You can just go to behavioruniversity.com, click on the webinar button, and sign up for their webinars. They've got a couple cool ones coming up. Preventing the emergence of challenging behavior, supporting female teens with level 3 low support needs, beyond behavior plans, applied behavior analysis in schools. That's a topic near and dear to my heart, of course, and lots more. And as I've said enough times to be blue in the face, if you see something you like over on the webinar page, you got to sign up, because these things do sell out. So you can check out everything over there at behavioruniversity.com. I also want to mention too that they have a newly revamped RBT course, and it's getting rave reviews. So go to behavioruniversity.com/observations and use the promo code podcast to save on your BU purchases. All right, let's get back to the rest of this conversation with Cody. Throughout the paper, there are all these quotes I had highlighted and passages I had highlighted. And so you brought up a ton of stuff where there are innumerable rabbit holes we can jump down. One of the things, though, is that I think it's worth maybe putting a pin in where we are right now, because there was one passage where you reference Skinner's concern about clients who aren't able to demonstrate counter control. So, and that shows up very early on in the discussion of the paper. So can you talk about why, what you think Skinner might have been talking about and how it relates to assent, and why you felt it was important to include this so early on in the paper? Because I think that will probably set up the other aspects of our conversation here.
For sure. So when I had published that initial paper on assent, I was getting a lot of citations and papers or in presentations saying that Morris et al. 2021 essentially invented the idea of assent in behavior analysis or client involvement and therapeutic decisions in behavior analysis, which as a history geek, I knew definitively to not be the case. And I think there can often be a misunderstanding of what some of the sort of heart of applied behavior analysis truly is, what some of the history is. Do we have history that is less than ideal? Of course, right? Any profession, frankly, does. But there's a lot of very important history that I think colors the way that we approach some of these things in a positive way today, starting with B.F. Skinner. In papers before the concept of applied behavior analysis even existed, Skinner was talking about some of these complications that we're experiencing today with how do we meaningfully create client-centered services, meaning services that are in the best interest of the individual receiving those services from their perspective. And so Skinner talked about that in a paper, ultimately saying, and in this case, he was describing residential treatment for folks with intellectual disabilities, saying that you have to be careful to understand that the contingencies that the people who are caretaking for those individuals are different from the individuals. To have meaningful services, you need to understand the perspective of the individuals receiving those services and understand there's a power differential, right? So in any treatment context where you're working with a vulnerable population, there's going to be a power differential, right? So if you think about a high school teacher and a high schooler, there's a power differential between those two individuals. When you add on to that typical power differential arrangement, someone who doesn't have communication skills or is vulnerable in other ways, that power differential increases. And Skinner was concerned about this, saying hey, we need to make sure we're addressing that power differential by creating what he ultimately called counter control, and saying, hey, this is a path forward in terms of making sure that clients' perspectives and personal interest in these services are being respected, understood, and included within treatment decisions. And so I think that's an amazing paper, right? I think it really kind of set the tone for caring about a client's perspective. Then you got other, amazing prominent behavior analysts, Wolf and Risley, when they're defining what it really means to do applied behavior analysis, specify when describing what applied is, that it's about the social impact, right? It's about the impact on the individuals receiving or being impacted by those services or research. And so I think we have this super, super rich history of thinking about the client's perspective, of trying to incorporate the client's perspective into services. The technology, the strategies have improved over time. The language has changed over time. But I think, frankly, at the heart and the core of applied behavior analysis, this theme has rung true and has been consistent. And I think certainly individual practitioners have deviated from that. But I think if we think about what is characteristic of applied behavior analysis, I'd say that's up there.
So assent is kind of under the umbrella of what I think you referred to in the paper as the general category of client-centered services. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
All right. And all right. So thanks for inventing the concept of assent. So we great. Just kidding. So what does this look like? I would say the majority of the listeners to this show are master's level BCBAs working, as we know, through the various board surveys. Most of them are working with individuals with autism. Most of those individuals are, school age or children. Not all, of course. What does this mean from a practical perspective in terms of obtaining assent? And let's talk about figuring out whether how to see if someone's assenting to a particular procedure first, particularly in the context of many of the individuals we work with have severely compromised communication skills. So give us some real world applications of what this might look like for the everyday BCBA.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate the question. So I think for folks listening interested in assent, I think first of all, understanding the importance of the definitional pieces that I described at sort of the beginning of this conversation, right? That assent is a very specific strategy that I think fits under the broader category of just strategies to get clients involved with therapeutic decisions, right? So assent is one way to get a client involved in therapeutic decisions. There are other ways of doing it, right? So social validity, I would say, is separate from assent. That's one way of getting them involved with therapeutic decisions, understanding how acceptable they find different procedures. And I can go into those. But for assent in particular, it's about getting a client some of those critical definitional components. So one being, getting them exposed to or familiar with a procedure in some way and giving them the opportunity to choose whether they're going to engage in that procedure or not, right? That's the simple way of arranging that. If you have clients that have communication difficulties, that process is a little bit more complicated than if someone has advanced communication skills and you can say, hey, buddy, we're going to go over to this table and we're going to work on this skill. Are you cool with doing that? Yes or no, right? That's sort of the traditional assent arrangement. If a client doesn't have those skills, then there are different ways of adapting it. It's not just about spoken communication. And so there are researchers who do things like concurrent chains or concurrent operants where they might expose a client to a condition. So they might go over, work with the client at that table, a few sessions, right? Have specific stimuli associated with that lesson. Could be like a card, it could be a specific room. And then after the client has become familiar with those procedures, then starting the opportunities for the client to continue to opt into going into that or choose not to by selecting those icons or going into that space. There are other ways that haven't been demonstrated yet that I'm interested in exploring, like the role that observational learning might have in this arrangement. So right now, most strategies are either you tell the client, what the procedure's like. If they don't have that skill, you just do the exposure to the procedures and then you allow them to opt into continuing or not. I'm interested in observational learning with clients that might have those skills. So instead of telling a client about a procedure, maybe I'll just model what the procedure looks like with another client or maybe a therapist, pretending to be a client. So I think there are different ways of adapting it depending on the client's skill set, right? And ultimately what we're trying to do here is maximize their opportunity to be involved with those clinical decisions regarding which procedures they're going to be exposed to.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you're ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. What I've heard about and read about the concurrent chains procedure for, having clients, I guess, discriminate between conditions, as it were. And this might get a little too meta. You let me know if I'm overthinking this, but isn't that in its own right a teaching procedure? And isn't that something that you would need to have, and if you were to take the concept of assent to its maximum interpretation, and maybe this is like one of those things where you're looking in the mirror and this, one of those things where there's multiple images and it goes on for infinity. In other words, you have to start somewhere. It would seem to be, and that somewhere may, and tell me if I'm wrong with this, but maybe in the absence of assent, right? So if I'm trying to teach a kid to discriminate between these two treatment conditions, that in itself is a teaching procedure for kids who don't discriminate well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. So
I mean, this could be like a 2 a.m. dorm room conversation. I'm fully willing to admit that, but I'm not trying to be ornery or anything like that. But I have this kind of like, I don't know. I just have this, desire to, kind of really firmly establish boundary conditions with some of these newer concepts that are, or at least concepts that are, I guess, new to me, I suppose. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% with you. And those are issues that I've grappled a lot with. So I appreciate you wanting to get into the nuance there. In my opinion, looking at the way that sort of the founders of behavior analysis talked about behavior analysis and its utility for helping individuals, my opinion is that the purpose of applied behavior analysis is to help individuals gain as much independence and autonomy as possible. And I think that goal of helping a client gain as much independence and autonomy as possible is what, to me, informs how we approach any and everything we're doing with a client. And so you're absolutely right that potentially exposing a client to a procedure to see if they will willingly engage in that procedure is a learning procedure that they did not assent to. So you're doing something with them they haven't assented to ultimately enable them to assent. Is that, in the perfect world of the clients getting to make any and all decisions, is that, and be completely independent and autonomous? Is that, hitting the head? No, but it is, I think, leading to more independence and autonomy. If I can help a client gain skills that will ultimately enable them to be more independent, more autonomous, engage in more choice, both in that moment and long term, I think we're winning, right? And so the thing about assent that I think can often be misunderstood is assent is not meant to be like an all or nothing. This isn't like clients should be assenting to any and all procedures. That's not realistic. It's frankly not appropriate. It's probably not therapeutic. But we do need to be designing all of our services around helping the clients gain independence and autonomy. Certainly, their involvement in those decisions are important for several reasons. And I think our job is to help them gain those skills that are going to, help them be more independent long term.
That's a thoughtful response. So if I'm understanding you correctly, it's even though exposure might be in the absence of assent, the outcome leads to more independence rather than less than there was at the starting point. Is that a fair way of summarizing what you said?
Yeah. And I think that, if you look at any typically developing child and skill set, it's not as if a child is going from making no decisions in their life to having complete control over all decisions in their life. Like the example I like to give is, I intimately remember the first time I went to like a gas station with my mom, and she gave me $1 bill heading into the gas station. And she said, "You can pick your treat and your drink," right? Like I remember that. I remember the gas station well. It was a marathon. I went in there, and I'm making those decisions, right? So I'm making a, in the grand scheme of things, a very, very minor decision, but it was such a big deal to me, right? I get to choose, right? And I get to budget this dollar. Fast forward now as an adult, right? I'm choosing my retirement package. I'm buying a car. I'm buying a house. It's approximations of some of the sort of bigger decisions that are ultimately necessary to gain experience and so that you can ultimately achieve higher levels of independence and autonomy. It's like nothing else, right? It's like saying a client that we want to be able to read fluently, oh, well, we have to start with letter identification. It's like, yeah, that's where you start with those things, right? Or, even prerequisites before that. You have to work up to some of these things.
Hey everyone, this is the last break of the podcast. So in case you missed the announcement at the beginning of this episode, the 2026 Verbal Behavior Conference is taking place March 26th and 27th in 2026 in Austin, Texas, or you can live stream or participate on demand through the magic of Behavior Live. They are pulling all the stops out for this one. There's going to be some special surprises that I'll mention down the road here, but minimally the event's going to include participation from Drs. Mark Sundberg, Patrick McGreevy, Kyle Miguel, Alice Schillingsberg, Sarah Frampton, Andresa D'Souza, and Danielle LaFrance. This is going to be great. There's also a pre-conference workshop on Wednesday, March 25th. And again, that's available through Behavior Live too. I would love to see you in Austin, Texas. I'm going to be there. I'm looking forward to seeing all the VBC regulars there, because this is a kind of a familial event almost. This is like my fifth or sixth time traveling to Austin for this event, and it's just so awesome to see the same people there every year and to see new people joining in person. It's, again, quite remarkable in that way. But if you can't get to Austin, you can, again, participate through Behavior Live. So just go to behaviorlive.com, search VBC to register in person or online. And don't forget, there's an early bird price right now, but that goes away. So take advantage of the discount now and pick up your ticket to the Verbal Behavior Conference. I'll see you in Austin. One of the things that really jumped out at me is that you cited some research by Northrop and colleagues about not taking verbal, for students I say students, I'm a school guy. So for clients who do have, complex verbal repertoires, there's some literature suggesting taking their verbal assent or, I guess the say-do correspondence, to be perhaps a little bit more specific, with with some skepticism. And so I'm curious. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think one of the important things when you're facilitating choice for clients is a broader category even than just assent, right? Assent is one type of choice. It's understanding that certainly a client's spoken or other verbal reports of what they're willing or not willing to do is useful. So I'm not saying completely discount that. I am saying that research has indicated that you might want to take it with a grain of salt, right? That it's not uncommon for a kid to say like, oh, yeah, I want to do that, or I don't want to do that, and not, frankly, just not really mean it, right? So an example I can give is I work with, in this case, it was an adult with developmental disabilities who essentially his primary like vocal behavior was just saying yes, yes, yes over and over again. And the group of staff that work with him constantly used that as an excuse to do whatever, frankly, they wanted with him and say that, oh, he opted into this. So they'd say, hey, do you want to do this? And he's just saying yes, yes, yes to everything. And they're saying, yeah, he agreed to do it. And I say, yeah, but he doesn't say no. And he literally says yes to everything. That's not an appropriate form of getting his involvement in the therapeutic decision, right? If you look at it with, maybe younger children, they might be much more likely to say yes to an adult, not necessarily understanding the implications of their decisions. And so I think we just have to be very, very careful with that. And there's a few things you can do to kind of see if that might be at risk. One of the strategies I talk about in the paper is whether it's a spoken indication of assent or some other indication of assent. If a client is looks like they're assenting to participate in a procedure, and the moment you start the procedure, you're seeing behaviors that would indicate they're not so keen on that procedure. They're indicating responses related to assent are probably inaccurate, right? And so you might want to take a step back and reevaluate the situation.
Where do you see, one of the things I've noticed is that there's an increasing focus on and description of assent procedures in the research literature. In fact, the last 3 Inside Java papers that we focused on had assent procedures of varying degrees, and some of them quite clever. And I'll note those in the show notes for those who want to go back and listen to them if they're interested in. But is this a sampling bias on my part, or is this something you're seeing more? I would imagine that you probably keep more on top of literature than I do. But so, yeah, what are you seeing in terms of papers being submitted for publication in Java or wherever else for that matter, in behavior analytics circles, I guess?
Yeah, I do think that the discussion of assent has really increased. One of the things that we had sort of recommended in that first assent paper, the Morris et al. 2021, was, again, that paper being a view of what other behavior analysts had been describing related to assent, saying that, hey, I can't remember the exact number. I want to say it was like 280 something papers even mentioned the term assent out of all of our journals for the entire span of the journals, right? So a small fraction of papers had really mentioned the term assent, and that our conclusion wasn't that people weren't necessarily doing assent practices. It was that they just, weren't, in the grand scheme of things, one of the most important things to describe within those papers. But our argument was that people should, describe that a little bit more, because it's going to be extremely helpful to other researchers and clinicians trying to understand better ways and strategies of arranging assent. To your point, Matt, there are some very, very ingenuitive and clever ways of arranging assent that we're starting to see now. There's really good stuff before as well, but just the idea that we can now share as a community, like, hey, here are ways that I'm approaching this with my clients or research participants that maybe had some, communication difficulties or other complications. So I think it's really great for our field. I think it's really enriching, and I think it's really informative in terms of different ways we can approach this.
Another just great discussion in the paper, a little passage, when you talked about free choice versus fair choice. Tell us a little bit about that and why you felt it was important to include in the paper.
Yeah. So I think earlier you kind of, in some ways, hinted at this topic a little bit, which is if you take assent or some of these related ideas to the logical ends, it can lead you into quagmires or things that are difficult to grapple with clinically or frankly even within research, right? So if you think about the idea of creating a fair choice, right? So one of the things I talk about in the paper and we've kind of talked about now is assent is a type of choice. And if you're giving a client the opportunity to choose whether or not to engage in a procedure, you want that to be a fair arrangement, right? You don't want to unduly or inappropriately bias their responding, right? Because then it's not really a choice at that point, right? And so that brings up a conceptually complicated, I don't know if concept or issue, which is how free of influence should those choices be? As a radical behaviorist, I don't believe that any behavior is free of influence, right? It's just not, and I think Diane Bannerman said it well in her famous paper in 1990. They said, I've got it pulled up actually, it's from a behavior analytic perspective, options in life are valued, but choice is anything but free. And I think that summarizes my feelings with assent, which is I don't believe that assent is free of influence. I don't believe that any behavior is free of influence. But I think, nevertheless, that the choice in assenting is a valuable choice or a valuable opportunity, a valuable behavior. And if we can't achieve this idea that it is free of influence, which again, I can't really grapple with, can we make it a fair choice? So not a free choice, not free of influence, but still fair. And to me, to establish a fair choice, you're not attempting to eliminate all influence, but you are attempting to eliminate any unduly influential variables or potentially coercive contingencies that would bias a response inappropriately.
So, in other words, you know that the there's going to be some influence, environmental, learning, whatever, but in trying to obtain assent, it's being aware of that and trying to make it as least bias as possible, knowing that you can't eliminate all of it.
Yeah, and I think the key piece there is that the differences in the outcomes of the choice options, they don't have to be equated. They have to be socially acceptable, in my opinion. So, for example, you said you're a school guy. So let's say we're working with a teacher in a school context. And I think I gave this example in the paper, maybe not. It's one of those things where you write a bunch of examples and then, who knows which one winds up in the paper. But teacher in a school context wanting her student to opt into like circle time or some sort of like group activity right away from the desk. So there are different ways that she could facilitate contingency. She could say, hey, you get your butt into the circle time or you're spending all day in detention, right? I would argue that that is a coercive and unfair contingency and an inappropriate choice, right? It's coercive. She could say, hey, you can sit at your desk. You can stay at your desk. And if you do, you'll sit there and then you're not going to have much to do. You're not going to give you anything special. You'll just kind of sit there and watch everyone, right? Or you can engage in the group activity, hopefully contacts and reinforcers or social engagement with your peers, maybe some physical reinforcers if they're moving around. And if you do that, I might even throw on top of that you're going to get a few minutes of choice with something that you're into, right? So the outcomes to those two choices, you want to engage in the group activity or not, those are different outcomes, right? I'm not pretending that they're equated. But I think that if you were to talk to any of the student stakeholders, right, the teacher, his family, frankly, other students, I think people would look at that and go, yeah, that's fair. That's not coercive, right? Yes, engaging in the group activity is frankly better in terms of the contingencies, or at least as we would expect it to be. But there's nothing coercive or manipulative about that. There's most of the things that are better about that activity are just natural to that activity. And I'm certainly not trying to equate that. And yeah, you're putting a cherry on top a little bit, but that it's not unreasonable contingency. And as a behavior analyst, of course, we're trying to, arrange contingencies that are going to be favorable to the client and favorable to behaviors that are going to be useful to the client. And so that's what I think is important with arranging a fair choice.
I see. Let's talk about withdrawing assent. There's one of the things, because I think that there's another example that something that came up in the paper that I want to highlight on, but I want to maybe pose maybe a practical challenge that practitioners might face in the field in terms of, assent withdrawal. As you mentioned, that's an important part of this process. But, as I was saying a few minutes ago, most people listening to this show are practicing applied behavior analysis in, clinic or in-home settings under some sort of insurance-funded model. And thank goodness I don't have to practice in that environment, but I have many, many friends and colleagues who do. And, one of the things that's important is showing progress and all the things that come along with reauthorizations and things like that. And I'm going to stop providing concrete examples because I'm going to rapidly expose my ignorance of how this stuff works. But you get what I'm saying, right? And I'm wondering, and I don't know if this shows up in the real world or not, but if you, again, I apologize for pushing the extreme examples here, but if someone is withdrawing assent for a particular treatment, and then and that has a negative outcome as it relates to their progress on the agreed upon objectives, whatever they happen to be, behavior reduction, skill improvement, etc. Can you understand the quandary that like your everyday BCBA faces as it relates to trying to balance these varying considerations? Yes, I want my client to make progress. In order for the client to make progress, I need them to be at the table, and we can, and so if they withdraw assent, and if I can't arrange things in such a way, you know what I'm saying, you know where I'm going with this. So but I'll stop torturing you with my analogy here. But can you speak to that concern a little bit? I guess.
Absolutely. And it's, I think, one of the primary concerns that comes up when I work with folks about this, because the complication here is that it requires balance, right? Balance that is not sort of a new topic to behavior analysts. So I frequently reference the Bannerman et al. 1990 paper. She was talking about the balance between habilitation and clinical progress even back then. But this idea of I need to make clinical progress, I need to help the clients make clinical progress, right? And I want to give them as much independence and autonomy as possible. Sometimes those things work well together. Oftentimes they do not work well together, right? So an example we can give there is how many, let's say, first graders do you think would opt in to doing math in school? How many of those kids are psyched? Maybe they've got an amazing math teacher, right? So maybe they're happy to hang out. But more often than not, right, they're not thrilled. That's not like, their favorite topic, right? In schools, doesn't matter if it's your favorite topic. Doesn't matter if you want to do it, frankly. You're doing math, right? On the flip side of that, where we have my wife is a clinical psychologist. So she practices like sort of traditional clinical psychology. And so I'm often comparing what I do, what she does, right? And like clinical psychology, for example, basically everything is via the client's choice to do something or not, right? It is very much a consent-assent arrangement because it's therapy. She has no power of contingencies over the clients. Everything is their choice to do something or not. And I think what puts behavior analysis in a precarious position is that we're kind of a little blend of both psychology and education. And so we have to walk that line, whereas my wife is like always consent-assent focused, right? And school is like very seldomly that. We have to try to blend those two things together in a way that is both enabling clients to be involved with therapeutic decisions and gain independence and autonomy, but also make therapeutic progress. And so I think one of the key pieces to that is for clinicians to understand the difference between, let's say, necessary procedures, things that like has to occur. I do stuff with challenging behavior, and frankly, it's a little bit easier to like frame it around this, but I'm happy to talk about skill act focused stuff too. But I've worked with a lot of clients who have to take life-saving or sustaining medication for a seizure disorder, right? I don't think that's a super uncommon issue with the population that we often work with. It's not my choice if that client takes that medication. It's not the child's decision. Frankly, the medical doctor is prescribing it. And frankly, even if the parents are like, no, the parents could get in a tremendous amount of trouble for not giving that kid medication. It's not really a choice. And so in that situation, that's a necessary procedure. Like to help that kid take the medication, that is necessary. That is non-negotiable. So I'm not going to try to get assent arranged within the kid taking that medication, right? I'm not going to say, hey, do you want to take the medication? They have to take the medication. What I will do in those moments where we do have to do things that they are necessary, and that could be if you're working in a school setting, working on certain academics, right? IEP says they got to work on academic goals. Like you're working on those goals. It's not, you can try to advocate at the IEP meetings, but there's legal requirements in school settings. There's insurance requirements in clinic settings. So understand those key pieces. And then as you can, build as much choice in around those things, right? So for the clients that I work with to take their medication, if we had the flexibility of like, can you choose the time of day you take it? Sometimes medical doctors, no, they take it at noon. That's it. There's no flexibility. Fair enough. Can they choose what they take it with? Can they choose who gives them the pill? Can they choose where they take it? Like how there's so many clinical decisions we make in any given day, right? Like I haven't tried to quantify this, but any given clinician, I mean, just think about your day and think about how many tiny little decisions you're making, And obviously, we're not going to get the client involved with all of those decisions. That's overwhelming for everyone. But when you're doing something meaningful with a client, understanding all those decisions you're making and figuring out how you can get them involved with as many of them as possible that would be meaningful to them. And so I think that that's sort of the key piece is, okay, yes, there's going to be necessary procedures, so you're going to do those. Can you build choice in around it? I wouldn't call that assent. They're not assenting, but nevertheless, they're still getting an opportunity to practice some level of independence and autonomy.
I'm glad you added that, because that example, and that idea of what's a necessary treatment, I think is really important here. Because I think you briefly mentioned this earlier on in the conversation, is that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you're welcome to clarify, but, it seems like there are some things that maybe some people in the discussion of assent might, I don't say get wrong, but maybe, oh, no, I think you said overgeneralize, I suppose, and so like, and again, I'm just painting extreme, perhaps to either make a point or be silly or whatever, but, there's this kind of like, the idea is like, if you don't get assent, you're going to behavior analyst hell, and so someone who's, raised Catholic, that, that's anyway. But, and I think also too that there's this perhaps caricature of the implementation of procedures in the absence of assent that is perhaps overly pejorative. In other words, if you think of if you have kids and especially young kids, and you take them to the pediatrician and the nurse is giving them their immunizations, after a certain my kids are, I've got two kids who are adults and one who's a senior in high school. So that early childhood era is way in the rearview mirror of mine. But I do remember that, so over time, once they understood, like, okay, I'm not going to die, when I get my whatever shot, whatever at the doctor's office, there's more of what you might consider assent to do that. But early on, when they were, very, very little, the nurse who was giving the injection, knowing full well that my kid was not down for this, but was nonetheless going through the process in an extraordinarily compassionate manner, which I think is the gift of so many nurses out there who do this work, or at least that's been my experience in a number of different situations. So, I think sometimes in the discussion of the different extremes, as it were, that it's one of those things where I really hope people aren't, and to use your terminology, overgeneralizing at least these types of necessary interventions. It's kind of like the same way of kind of think of like Glenn Latham's The Power of Positive Parenting, where he's it's been a long time since I've looked at that stuff, but if I recall correctly, he talks about like compassionately delivering the consequences to his child. It's like, yeah, I'm really sorry you can't use the car tonight because, we had talked about you coming home after curfew and this is just what, so it's like this is, it's delivering a punishment. We have this character of punishment being like, being, physically abused or something like that, and I don't know. It's just, again, I probably overthink way too many of these things, but, I think, I think the idea of the limitations of these sorts of things and what to do when there's an absence of it is really important.
Absolutely. And I've had the opportunity to work with groups that have been on sort of either side of the spectrum. I work with clinics that have really grabbed on to the idea of like assent and other ideas being very important. And so they've been like, kid makes all the decisions. Or it's right, it's what they tried. And then maybe by the time they're working with me, they're realizing that's maybe not as fruitful as they'd hoped. As it turns out, 4-year-old kids aren't opting into doing things that are very therapeutically beneficial for them, right? And I've seen the other side, which is clinics saying, I don't give a hoot, they don't say this, but like, I don't give a hoot what the clients want. It's our way, right? We are sort of rigidly following. We do everything precisely the same with all of our clients. Doesn't matter. We're not really individualizing things. And I think both are dangerous and can be problematic. But I understand where both are coming from. And for the folks that are maybe very passionate about Assent and really want to embed it in treatment as much as possible, sometimes when they hear my talks on this topic, it in some ways, it might be invalidating, or it's almost like a pill that they're having to swallow, which is like, I'm saying, hey, Assent isn't the end all be all, that it's a very specific thing, that it really is appropriate in specific contexts. Shouldn't be the only thing that is being considered in therapeutic decisions. And I think oftentimes can maybe even be some identity built up around the idea of like, well, we're like Assent based. And my caution to that is, again, you're not going to find anyone who's more passionate about Assent and other ways of involving clients in therapeutic decisions than me. However, I do understand some of the nuance that has to be grappled with when making therapeutic decisions, right? And so folks who have this idea of where we're Assent based, I appreciate, the enthusiasm, I appreciate the efforts. What I would encourage you guys to do is to consider Assent as being one small little piece of the overall concept of getting clients involved in therapeutic decisions. And so if you find yourself going like, this is like, Assent is too limiting, right? Because I can't go through and inform the client of every little thing and do these formal evaluations of Assent, that's completely fine. What I think you're probably most interested in and focused on is trying to get your clients involved with therapeutic decisions. And there's a ton of ways of doing that. And so to me, it's like, it's not just doing Assent, it's looking more broadly at the idea of how we're maximizing client involvement in therapeutic decisions while balancing habilitation or clinical progress and doing so on an individual basis with our clients to, again, help them gain as much independence and autonomy as possible. But simply presenting choice without helping them develop skills isn't going to lead to independence and autonomy either.
When you said, this is a podcast, so most people won't see this, but when you said people build up an identity around their practice as Assent-based, I've seen that a lot, and again, I also agree with and also admire the spirit with which people want to practice in a way that is client focused, compassionate. Avoids, as Hanley likes to say, avoids a non-televisability. Sorry, whatever. It's presentable, I guess, is perhaps a different way of saying it. But it's also one of those things that perhaps falls in the category of what I call hyphenated ABA. Which is all the thing, compassion ABA, trauma-based ABA, Assent-based ABA, affirming ABA. It's as almost kind of almost as branding terms, as it were, and again, I'm not, this is coming out all the wrong ways, so I'm sorry if I'm offending people in the audience. I just I think these are things we all want it to be under the umbrella of ABA and without the necessary some specializations of like, well, I'm not, it's like to the other extreme that you're saying, the clinics that are more of like my way, the highway type of thing, and the last thing I want to do is really engage in any type of internecine tribalism, inside the field of amongst these things. But boy, there's so much to this. There's so many nuances, and to be able to write a paper that delves into all of these things in a way that is that is cogent and helpful. I just think it's I really appreciate the work that you and your colleagues put into this. I've held you a little bit beyond your time beyond the time that I promised here, but I've got just a couple more questions, dude.
I'm
All right.
happy to stay on longer.
All right, great. So one of the things I see people ask about all the time on social media and things like that are, tools and checklists and things like that. And I've made a whole host of checklists. So I'm not throwing stones at glass houses, but but I suppose, but not on a topic at this, I guess, with this level of complexity, I suppose, in my defense. But, are tools like this appropriate for assessing whether, either assent skills or whether someone's, assenting to a procedure that's already ongoing, or assessing assent, the withdrawal of assent and things like that? I know I don't want to name them. I don't want to out them on the podcast, but there's a person I have huge respect for, and they do great work, and they talk about a lot of procedures they're kind of like against manualization because you don't want to get like a one size fits all type of analysis of whatever the issue is. Again, I'm trying to withhold the specifics because it would be very obvious who I'm talking about. But what do you think about that? What do you think about like manualizing this stuff, or on the one hand, you could see how it would put more of this information out there and things like that. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely understand the appeal to checklist or decision trees or things like that simplify these decisions, right? And I completely understand it. I'm well aware of the complexities of assent and other ways of involving clients in therapeutic decisions, as I've written about. But my concern with checklists, as I've seen them attempted or have even just thought about myself, is that I think at this point, there are so many nuances to meaningfully arranging assent and other ways for clients to get involved with therapeutic decisions, and very little known about sort of some of the specifics. So, for example, in the paper, I talk about you can utilize existing behavior analytic skill and language assessments to gauge which type of assent procedures might be useful for a client. So, for example, depending on where the client scores on a VB map might tell me a lot about their ability to engage meaningfully in like a traditional assent arrangement where I just can, tell you about the procedure and then ask you if you want to go do it or not, right? If a client's scoring low on a VB map, it's probably not going to be a very useful procedure, right? I might get some information about their observational learning skills in some of these assessments, right? That might color the way that I approach things. But there hasn't really been enough research to really understand all of those nuances. I think they all require a lot of sort of clinical decision making. And while I, again, completely understand why people want simplified decisions and the appeal to that, I just don't think we're there. And, I have my students ask me for decision trees and checklists and stuff all the time. The people I consult with ask me for that. If I thought it was reasonable, if I thought that, it would actually be helpful for all of the clients that would be impacted by it, I'd be supportive of it, right? Like my whole thing is that I want to figure out ways of helping clinicians maximize opportunities for clients to be involved with therapeutic decisions. I just, as well as I know the topic, I just don't think it's realistic at this point. That might change as more and more research comes out, but I don't think it's realistic in the near future.
That's a great segue, because one of the things I was curious about is, if someone is, either in a master's or doc program, they're really interested in assent, what are some research questions that you see that are still, there's hanging out there that folks might want to tackle, or whether they're established people with labs and things like that who are interested in this topic? What are some questions that you think would be, fruitful to look into from a research perspective?
It's such a great question. And I've had, the opportunity to get to work with a lot of students. My students have been an outside committee member on other people's theses and dissertations and stuff. And the advice that I typically give on this topic, and this is probably true for any topic, frankly, is take a baby step. Don't try to take a leap. Like, we're so underdeveloped in this area of research that a lot of times students are initially like, I want to figure out the checklist. Like, I want to figure out the decision tree and validate that. Again, I understand the appeal to that, but there's just so many things we don't understand. They'll often try to lump together all of the ways of involving clients in therapeutic decisions under one idea and try to take them all on. It's like, I would recommend focusing on small individual components. So, for example, assent, right? So if you're really wanting to do stuff related to assent in particular, what are some of the prerequisite skills and how do they correlate to different ways you can do assent? Research on that would be, I think, pretty interesting. The impact on the context that assent is being solicited in, I think, is very interesting. So, for example, if I am in a school setting and I'm doing special instruction on reading fluency or something like that, if I ask the student if they want to assent to that procedure while the rest of their class is working on reading or math or something, they might be willing to do that. If I ask them in the middle of recess, I would suspect that most kids are like, no, right? And so there's all these little nuances of ways that can impact whether a client assents or not. So I think looking at those very specific individual variables to help us start fleshing out a lot of the components that are going to be impactful on assent and other ways of involving clients in therapeutic decisions, I think is a good starting point. I've seen a lot of people interested in the relation between indices of happiness and assent. And I think indices of happiness as a measure within treatment is really, really useful. I've published research on that and, that topic. However, I think it can be a little confusing for folks sometimes because I see that indices of happiness are often assumed to indicate assent, which I think is a dangerous game for several reasons. And so, if people are interested in indices of happiness, I'd say, stay in that lane, focus on that measure as a useful measure in and of itself. Be careful not to conflate it with assent. But I think just accepting how vast this area of research is and committing to taking the tiny little baby step is the recommendation I would have there.
Awesome. And that's probably good advice for whatever topic someone's getting into from a thesis or dissertation perspective. So, Cody, it's been awesome having you on here. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I appreciate you tolerating all my but questions in a good spirit. Want to just wrap up here. Want to give you the opportunity. If there's anything else you want to say on assent that I haven't thought to ask, I want to give you the opportunity to do that. And if not, why don't you take us out with some advice for the newly minted BCBA?
So I don't think we missed anything important. So thanks for doing your homework and asking really good questions. I appreciate that. For advice for newly minted BCBAs interested in assent, my recommendation is to take that passion for assent that you have, right? You're wanting to help clients get involved with therapeutic decisions, take agency, practice independence and autonomy. Take that passion and decentralize the concept of assent and instead focus on client involvement in therapeutic decisions broadly, because it's a much, much more flexible paradigm that will enable you to involve clients in all sorts of decisions, be it decisions about their overall goals that they're working on, or maybe you're measuring indices of assent, or maybe you're looking at indicating responses or engagement. all of these things are incredibly important. All, I think, are leading to client-centered services, but they're not Assent specifically, right? Assent is just one piece of the puzzle. And so instead of getting overly focused on Assent, I say take that larger, more zoomed out view of the tool set that is really available and focus those energies on that. So when you're entering, agencies, working with individuals, looking for ways of involving them in therapeutic decisions broadly, including Assent, figuring out ways of getting Assent embedded, but also just taking on that broader topic.
Great. That's great advice to conclude the podcast with. Dr. Cody Morris, thanks so much for joining me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks. I appreciate it. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.